this is Roger Leisner for Radio Free Maine.
Hey, is it free?
February 20, 1997, Boston University. Tonight, Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky speak on the Cold War and the University. Jacob Sleeper Hall, Boston, Massachusetts.
Roger Leisner.
And there's John Holder going in. John Holder, who has taped both Chomsky and Zinn before for Radio Free Maine.
Good evening. I want to thank you all for coming out tonight in support of Professor Noam Chomsky and Professor Howard Zinn, as well as the Barnes & Noble at Boston University Author Series. Noam Chomsky is a professor at MIT's Department of Linguistics and Philosophy and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the National Academy of Science. Howard Zinn is a professor emeritus at Boston University. He is the author of A People's History of the United States and a recent memoir, You Can't Be Neutral on a Moving Train. Tonight, they will discuss their newest accomplishment, the Cold War and the University, towards an intellectual history of the post-war years. Please join me in welcoming Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn.
I guess that means I go first. Just to disabuse anyone of misimpressions, the book isn't my, can you hear? The book isn't my accomplishment, and I'm sure Howard will say it's not his accomplishment. It was a project to which we happened to contribute, as did other people. My contribution was actually an interview. So it's a joint enterprise, first volume of several, on the thesis of the Cold War and the University. I'm not going to talk specifically about the book. I'll say a couple of words about the Cold War and where the universities fit into it, and maybe something about what happens now that the Cold War is technically over. There's a huge amount of historical scholarship on the course, and I'm going to try to review it. There's also a standard picture, which I'll accept, of the course of that scholarship that sort of goes in the structure of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. The thesis is the original position from the origins, sometimes called the orthodox or the traditional view. And that is that in a phrase, that the Cold War was the result of Soviet aggressiveness and intransigence, and the United States played a completely defensive and reactive role. It was simply a matter of light versus dark, absolute perfection versus total evil. If you want to read it in its purest form, if you haven't done it, you should read NSC 68, which everyone recognizes as the standard Cold War document, declassified, and no one ever quotes. If you look, and I think the reason it's never quoted is because the rhetoric is so outlandish, and the image it gives of the culture of the period is so intolerable that it's better to refer to it indirectly rather than to actually quote it. Well, that's the thesis. The antithesis is what's called revisionist scholarship that comes along in the mid-1960s as part of the whole ferment of that period. And that took the heretical position that the Cold War was a kind of an interaction with both sides playing some role in initiating it and sustaining it. The synthesis, which is sometimes called post-revisionism, is basically the traditional Orthodox view with a few nuances. The leading figure, by common consent, is John Lewis Gaddis, sometimes called the Dean of Diplomatic Historians, most authoritative studies and the leading figure in the field. I'll just refer to him. The revisionist heresy, when it came along, it caused enormous uproar and concern, which itself tells you something about the period. Arthur Schlesinger in October 1966 wrote that it's time to blow the whistle on the heresy. The date is kind of interesting because the heresy had barely been expressed at that time. In fact, he was responding to a review by a young historian of a book about the Cold War, in which the historian said, Gar Alperovitz it was, said that the Cold War cannot be seen simply as an American response to Soviet challenges, but rather has to be traced to a mutual interaction of insidious suspicions for which blame must be shared by all. Okay, that was the heresy, and this Schlesinger was so outraged, he at once wrote that it's time to blow the whistle on this before things really get out of hand and the plague spreads. A couple of years later, Henry Kissinger lamented that in the 1960s, European intellectuals began to argue that the Cold War was caused by American as well as Soviet policy, and a verbal and sometimes violent minority in the United States challenged the hitherto almost unanimous conviction that the Cold War had been caused by Soviet intransigence alone. In other words, the pillars were really collapsing. He was writing at a time of great concern about what was called the crisis of democracy. It was the title of an important book, which, again, everyone ought to read. First and only serious study by the Trilateral Commission in the mid-'70s. They were concerned by the fact that during the 60s in all the trilateral areas, Europe, Japan, and the United States, there had been sectors of the population that are normally quiescent and obedient, had become organized and had tried to enter the political arena to press their demands, which created a crisis of democracy which has to be overcome by driving them back to apathy and obedience and out of the political arena where they have no place to be. One aspect of this crisis of democracy, incidentally, this was from the liberal end of the spectrum, these comments. These are the groups around the Carter administration. In fact, the whole Carter administration was drawn from this. One of the problems was that the media were becoming much too adversarial, and they said it might be necessary to think about means to try to control the media because they're really also getting out of hand. And another problem had to do with what they called the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young. That meant the universities, the schools, the churches, and so on. They weren't doing their job of indoctrinating the young properly, and something would have to be done about that. And the spread of this awful heresy, saying that maybe it wasn't just pure light versus pure darkness, was one aspect of that. The post-war synthesis was just, the post-revisionist synthesis was just kind of coming into appearing at that point to try to, end this heresy. And its own framework and point of view is kind of interesting. As I said, the main figure is John Lewis Gaddis. He writes, and I basically agree with what he says, so I'll just quote him. He says that he traces the origins of the Cold War to 1917, which I think is correct. Another phase began in 1945. As you know, right after the Bolshevik Revolution, within a couple of months, there was an invasion of Russia by the West, in which the United States participated. Incidentally, it was taken pretty seriously. This has yet the documents on what I'm just going to now say have been out for about 15 years, but they have yet to enter the public record as far as I know. The British took the thing so seriously that they used poison gas on the Northern Front. And remember, this was right after World War I. That was the ultimate atrocity at the time. But they weren't kidding around. The Western intervention, Gaddis describes it, and he says it was justified, and in fact it was defensive. It was, I'll quote, "It was in response to a profound and potentially far-reaching intervention by the new Soviet government in the internal affairs, not just of the West, but of virtually every country in the world, namely the revolution's challenge to the very survival of the capitalist order." So the security of the United States was already in danger in 1917, not just 1950, and the invasion of Russia was entirely warranted in defense. Well, in defense against what? In defense against an internal change in Russia and announcement of revolutionary intentions. That justifies invasion in defense because it's a threat to us. Notice, by the same logic, if, say, the United States calls for global capitalism or something, any country in the world that feels that they want to take some different course is entirely justified in carrying out a defensive invasion of the United States, and if they don't have the power for that, at least carrying out international terrorism, which is like, say, blowing up the World Trade Center, which is several steps short of aggression. But the point is, he has captured the mentality exactly by leaving the Western orbit and announcing that they wanted others to do so too. That was an intolerable challenge, and it does justify aggression in order to block it. That is, incident, as I'm sure you know, the standard justification that's given all the time for intervention in the Third World. And remember, Russia was the original Third World. That goes back to the 15th century, when I think that's crucial to bear in mind when you think about the Cold War. Back around the 15th century, Europe began to divide, with the West beginning to develop and the eastern half becoming sort of its service area. You know, raw materials, markets, cheap labor, that kind of thing. And that division continued. Actually, there's a fault line right down Germany. The division continued right into early this century. The East became relatively more impoverished, that is, relative to the West, right until early in this century. And then in 1917, Russia adopted a course, I'll quote, that reduced its willingness and ability to complement the industrial economies of the West, which is the major threat of communism. Actually, I'm quoting from a very important 1955 study by a prestigious study group of the political economy of U.S. foreign policy, and I think they hit it right on the nose. That was the threat of communism, the refusal to complement the industrial economies of the West, which is the job of the Third World. It was still worse than that. Russia was what later came to be called a virus that was spreading the infection to others. That's what Gaddis is talking about. They were calling on others to follow that same unacceptable course right into the 1960s, when our record runs dry. That's where the record of declassified documents ends. Right into the 1960s, the major concern of U.S. and British planners was precisely that, Soviet success. They were going to be a model that others might follow. So, for example, Arthur Schlesinger, in a memo to, very recently declassified memo to John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy, talking about Cuba, says that the problem is the spread of the Castro idea of taking taking things into your own hands and demanding the opportunity for a decent living. All of this stimulated by the Soviet Union, which is presenting itself as a model for modernization in one generation. So not only did they refuse to complement the industrial economies of the West, violating the rules for the Third World, but they're even inducing others to do so. Incidentally, by this time, the United States had also already, in secret, formally determined that it would overthrow the government of Cuba. Well, this is the basic logic of the North-South conflict. And I think if you look at the Cold War, it applies very well. Of course, the scale was so different in this case that it took on a life of its own. But the logic is not dissimilar from the threat posed by Grenada and Nicaragua and Cuba and lots of others. And it's not very surprising, I think, that after 1989, the region is returning to what it was, pretty much. So the parts that were part of the West, like, say, Czech Republic, at least, and Western Poland, they're returning to the West. They're becoming what they were, part of the industrial societies. The others are sinking into deep third world misery with all the standard third world properties. Here, it's all attributed to the failures of communism. It's a little hard to explain why it happened after 1989, and also why it so totally resembles everything that's gone on in the places that have continued to be, to play their role of being complementary to the industrial economies of the West, not precisely by choice. So in brief, I think Gaddis is basically right. He's right in the post-revisionist consensus, right in dating the Cold War, and also in identifying the challenge. The challenge was success and the threat that it might be a model to others. I think one interesting result of contemporary scholarship is it's now overwhelmingly obvious and really not denied on any side that the threat was pretty much what George Kennan said in secret in 1947, not a military challenge, but a political challenge, namely this political challenge. The unwillingness to accept the role of being complementary to the West and even instigating others to follow this idea of trying to get a decent life and doing it your own way, the virus effect. And that goes right up to the present. I can give you examples from right now, but time's short, so I won't proceed. Anyhow, in my view, that's the essence of the Cold War, and I think you see, and the attitudes that it engenders, and I think you see it right in the orthodox scholarship. I don't think you have to go to critical scholarship to see this. It comes right out in the mainstream. So, for example, in the fact that, say, Gaddis's view, which I described, doesn't seem strange to anyone. So, yeah, that's right. I mean, we have a right to invade another country if it carries out an internal change and says that others should do so likewise, particularly if it seems to be succeeding and maybe offering a model that others might want to follow. That's a challenge, and obviously we have a right to use violence in self-defense. You might search for a critique of that view. Well, where do the universities figure in all this? Two major respects. First of all, they have to forge the kind of doctrinal framework, make sure they are, after all, the institutions responsible for indoctrinating the young, and they got to make sure that the young are properly indoctrinated, and in fact, that the old are indoctrinated too. The people who do the indoctrinating have to believe it, and other people who, reach a general audience in the through the major mechanisms. You're allowed to have hawks and doves, so that's fair. That's not only allowed but required. There should be very lively debate. That's very useful for a propaganda system, but it should be within an extremely narrow framework. So the debate should be, as it was, for example, over Nicaragua, biggest issue of the 80s. Actually, I've reviewed a lot of the record on this. The hawks say we should overthrow the government by violence. The doves say, no, that's going to be too costly for us. We should overthrow it in other ways and restore it to what was called the Central American mode, imposing regional standards, that is, the standards of El Salvador and Guatemala. I'm quoting Tom Wicker and other doves. And between those extreme views, you should have a terrific controversy. But the idea that there might be something outside that framework should be unthinkable. Quite apart from the doctrinal side, the universities have played a very significant role within the domestic economy. That's discussed in a number of those papers. I lost track of time. Am I going on too long?
I'm not keeping track of time.
I'm supposed to talk briefly.
Don't worry about it.
A couple more minutes. Okay. Sorry, I should have looked at my watch, but I forgot. There's an extremely important and role that the universities have played within the entire domestic economy. in brief, I'm sure you must, if you don't know this, you really should. It's very important. During the 30s, there was, of course, a huge depression. The New Deal didn't do much with it. The war got us out of it. The war was extremely successful from the U.S. point of view. U.S. industrial, the U.S. had a kind of a command economy. Industrial production tripled. The country was producing like mad. There was a lesson that was taught later. It was called the lesson of Keynes, namely that if the government mobilizes resources and pours them into the economy, they can stimulate production and maintain a sort of state capitalist economy. Furthermore, that lesson was taught to exactly the guys who had to learn it, namely the corporate managers who were brought to Washington to run the semi-command economy that succeeded in this. They got the message, and they carried it into the post-war period. It was assumed across the board, economists, industrialists, everyone else, that if the spigot was turned off, the country would go right back to the Depression. And if you read the business, this isn't even secret. It's all in the business press in the late 40s. In the business press in the late 40s, Fortune, Business Week, and so on, there was a lot of talk about how advanced industry cannot survive in a competitive, unsubsidized, free enterprise economy, and the government must be the savior. There was also discussion about how that should be done, and for rather sensible reasons, it was decided that the military was the best way to do it. One of the reasons, it was recognized that social spending would work, that everybody knew, this sort of Keynesian stories you learn in first-year economics about hiding dollars in the sand and so on, that they understood. They knew that social spending could have the same stimulative effect, but it has a downside. Social spending has a redistributive effect. And it has a democratizing effect, like people care where there's going to be a hospital. They don't have any opinions on what kind of missile you should build. And furthermore, social spending is not a direct subsidy to the corporate sector. It's kind of indirect. Military spending has none of these problems. It's redistributive, but upward. It's anti-democratic, keeps people out of policy, and it's a direct gift to corporations. So besides, it's easy to sell. And that was put very frankly. So Truman's first Secretary of the Air Force, Stuart Symington, advised that the word to use is not subsidy, the word to use is security. And that's exactly the story from then till today. You use the word security when you mean subsidy. Then people hide, and the Cold War was very helpful. It existed, but it was stimulated. It both contributed to this and was stimulated by it. And in fact, without proceeding, just about you'll take a look at any dynamic sector of the economy since then and right up till today, and you'll find it's very heavily dependent on this system of the public is assuming the costs and also assuming the risks, incidentally, if anything goes wrong, but the profit being privatized. That's the existing system. It comes straight out of the early Cold War period, and it interacts closely with the Cold War, and the universities play a crucial role here. First of all, they're like, say, we're IT. Why do I have a job? Very simple. Because MIT is part of the funnel by which public funds get poured into high-tech industry, and it gives them a little luxury to have fringes around the edge, like a music department or, me or something. But that's, basically what a good part of the universities are about, as well as creating the doctrinal framework for all of this, which means not only instilling Cold War ideology, but preventing people from knowing things like that. So try to find a department of the university that studies the way the American economy works, namely this way. It's not in the economics department because they're doing, models of economies in 10-dimensional space or something. It's not in the political science department because they're studying electoral policies and so on and so forth. If there's a business school, it's probably taught in the business school. But that's about, and it's not certainly not in the general curriculum, but these are the core issues of the American economy. So you read the newspapers today, front pages all full of, say, the great decision at the World Trade Organization to, let the U.S. telecommunications industry take over the world, which is what it amounts to. And this is supposed to show our passion for free markets and the terrific American way and the way we're exporting our values. I mean, I'm quoting. How did the telecommunications industry in the United States get to the point where it can take over the world? I mean, like they put up the satellites and created the computers and the networking and the ARPANET and the software and the fiber optics cables and so on? Absolutely not. This is public resources funneled in large measure through the universities, done a lot of the direct organization by DARPA, you know, the Pentagon Research Agency, which sort of started up the startup companies and initiated most of the new ideas. When it finally works, you hand it over to private corporations, and then our passion for free markets, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the heart of a good indoctrination system is not letting people see what is so obvious, you know. I mean, it's right in front of everyone's eyes, but you're not supposed to see it, and if the system really is working, like if the institutions for indoctrination of the young and everyone else are functioning properly, so there's no crisis of democracy, then yeah, you can write about the passion for free markets and all the rest of it. Well, all of this raises a number of questions, and they're not trivial. One question is whether public funds, how should they be used? You know, how should public resources be used to lay the basis for the economy and the intellectual culture of the future, say? That's one question. Not trivial, I don't think. A second is, should the results of whatever comes out of public funds be handed over just automatically to unaccountable private power? Third question, who should make the decisions about this? Should it be a topic of public discussion and debate? And should the public be involved in deciding on these non-trivial questions? Well, there's very little. About the third question, there shouldn't be any debate, at least among people who think that democracy might be an amusing idea. But the idea, in practice, it just doesn't happen.